Stephen A. Smith called it a disaster. Cam Newton called it the end. Kevin Stefanski's Browns weren't just losing, they were unraveling. Reports of misleading injury designations, suppression of locker room dissent, and strategic chaos painted a picture of a coach more focused on optics than outcomes. Newton's attack on Stefanski's failure to establish stability hit hard because it echoed what so many had danced around. Leadership in Cleveland wasn't broken. It was never built in the first place. If you're into the real story and all the messy twists they don't show on highlight reels, go ahead and subscribe. And if you're sticking around to see how this Browns QB chaos plays out, you should definitely be subscribed. And with 13 quarterbacks in the rear view, the damage wasn't theoretical. It was measurable. For Newton, the chaos wasn't surprising. It was a natural endpoint of years of misaligned priorities. His takedown wasn't just about Sanders, or even about Stefanski alone. It was about the broader failure of a system that values control over communication. The modern NFL demands more: transparency, development, and strategic vision. Newton's critique clarified that Stefanski's downfall wasn't caused by a single loss, but by years of ignoring what the league now considers non-negotiable. Cam Newton did not hold back. Sitting across from the mic with full conviction, he let it rip, no filters, no dancing around the issue. His target? Kevin Stefanski. His reason? A complete failure to develop quarterbacks, lead a franchise, or even show signs of learning from years of dysfunction. Newton's voice carried the weight of a former MVP who's seen how it's supposed to work and knows what dysfunction looks like when it's dressed up as strategy. He wasn't speaking in hypotheticals. He listed the receipts. 13 quarterbacks cycled through Stefanski's tenure. 13. That's not rotation. That's chaos. That's instability at the core of the most important position in football. Newton's point was clear. If you're the head coach and your QB room looks like musical chairs every season, that's on you. Then Orlovsky tried to push back. He threw out the usual defenses: context, injuries, system changes. But Newton wasn't having it. He cut through the excuses with one brutal truth. Leadership is about building something that lasts, not hiding behind circumstances. Stefanski hadn't built anything. He'd managed a revolving door, and every quarterback who walked through it came out worse. Orlovsky's attempt to make it sound like the front office, or bad luck, deserved more blame, only gave Newton more fuel. When the same thing happens over and over again, that's not luck. Newton snapped. That's a system failure. It wasn't about one bad game or one misstep. It was about a pattern, a long, undeniable pattern of mismanagement. The irony is, Stefanski was never short on words. He gave post-game quotes, press conferences, and sound bites filled with coach speak about process and evaluation. But as the seasons wore on, the disconnect between what he said and what actually played out became impossible to ignore. You don't cycle through 13 quarterbacks and still try to play the long game narrative. Stefanski often framed decisions as strategic, rooted in development timelines. But Newton's point was that those timelines never led anywhere. The QBs didn't develop. The offense didn't evolve. And when young talent showed flashes, it wasn't nurtured. It was either bench misused or left to flounder without support. The Shadur-Sanders situation brought this all to a boiling point. Training camp should have been the place where a young quarterback got meaningful reps, a chance to get in rhythm with the first-team offense. But Stefanski had other plans. Sanders was boxed out. Newton pointed out bluntly that Sanders wasn't just left out of the starting rotation. He wasn't even given the opportunity to grow into it. This wasn't about being QB1 on day one. It was about not even being allowed to compete. In a league where development is everything, and where first-rounders are thrown into the fire early, Sanders was sidelined in camp while the Browns played favorites. Newton saw it as a betrayal of process and of the player. Even when Sanders did get snaps in practice, they were with the second team, often behind a porous line, and with limited weapon support. Newton highlighted that too. What kind of evaluation are you running if the reps are designed to fail? Stefanski's staff wasn't just limiting Sanders' chances. They were setting him up to underperform. Newton didn't mince words. He called it systemic sabotage, not out of malice, but out of incompetence. a coach so locked into his own structure that he couldn't recognize when a player needed room to grow. Instead, every decision felt reactionary, designed to protect a narrative rather than foster progress. Then came the Tennessee game. Sanders finally got a chance and exploded for 4 touchdowns. It was the kind of performance that should have shifted the entire trajectory of his role with the team. Instead, STEFANSKI benched him in the second half. Newton and others saw it as the ultimate proof. The coach didn't trust the player, even after he delivered. That decision became symbolic of the entire STEFANSKI era. A coach choosing control over momentum, benching a hot quarterback in a must-win moment because it didn't fit the plan. It wasn't just tone-deaf, it was destructive. The Browns went on to lose that game, and any lingering belief in Stefanski's quarterback instincts went with it. After the game, Sanders didn't lash out. He kept it professional. But the message was clear in his tone. He had questions about the timing, about the process, about why a breakout performance wasn't enough to earn trust. Sanders had stepped up only to be shoved back down. Newton made it a central example in his critique. How can a young quarterback lead if he's never empowered to? The Browns had something real in Sanders. And instead of building around it, Stefanski treated it like a threat to his control. Newton saw that clearly, and so did a growing chorus of critics. The team had lost not just a game, but credibility. In the days that followed, Sanders gave more interviews. And while he stayed respectful, his words were measured and intentional. He talked about preparation, about being ready when called, about being confused by the sudden benching. You could hear it. He wasn't just disappointed. He was disillusioned. This wasn't just about one game. It was about an entire season of being handled like a backup project instead of priority. Newton used those interviews to spotlight how fragile the coach-player relationship had become. When trust is gone, so is cohesion. Stefanski had lost both. Stephen A. Smith weighed in next, and he didn't hold back. On his platform, he called out the Browns for their inability to groom a single quarterback under Stefanski. He echoed Newton's analysis almost point for point. 13 quarterbacks, no development arc, no long-term plan. Smith didn't try to sugarcoat it. He called it a coaching indictment, plain and simple. For someone like Smith, who doesn't toss those words around lightly, it signaled that the league had taken notice. Stefanski wasn't just losing fans. He was losing the media. Stefanski's response was predictable. In the post-game interview, he leaned on structure and process, talked about sticking to the plan. He refused to address the benching of Sanders directly, framing it as a rotation call. But at that point, no one was buying it. The press asked. Fans shouted. Analysts rolled their eyes. The plan? That plan had failed 13 quarterbacks. That plan benched a 4-touchdown rookie mid-game. That plan had eroded the team's morale. And now, it had eroded Stefanski's job security. Cam Newton's voice carried the weight of every quarterback who'd been tossed aside for the sake of scheme. Every young player who got told to wait their turn, while a coach tried to preserve his system instead of growing with his talent. Newton wasn't just calling out Kevin Stefanski. He was exposing a pattern that exists in too many NFL buildings. Coaches who fear change more than they fear losing. He pointed out that Shedeur Sanders was a change, a player who brought energy, instinct, and leadership. But instead of adjusting the system to fit that spark, Stefanski suffocated it. Newton called it coaching malpractice. Not because Sanders failed, but because he was never given a chance to succeed within a structure that embraced him. The more Stefanski spoke, the less it mattered. His answers became noise. He gave the same lines about protecting young players, about needing more time, about trust. But Newton tore through that facade with a single point. When exactly was that time going to come? Because after a season of minimal reps, benchings, and double standards, it sure looked like more time meant never. Newton reminded everyone that coaching in the NFL is not just about X's and O's. It's about belief. It's about telling a player, we got your back, and showing it with actions. Sanders never got that message. And Newton's fiery takedown of Stefanski made that failure feel even bigger than a single season. It felt like the collapse of philosophy. In a follow-up interview, Shedeur Sanders showed a maturity that made Stefanski's decisions look even worse. He didn't throw anyone under the bus. He didn't point fingers. But his words cut deeper than a rant ever could. He talked about wanting to contribute, about earning his shot, about preparing like a starter, even when he wasn't treated like one. And when the topic turned to his game against Tennessee, Sanders gave the most telling answer, "I felt ready." That was the line. That's what stuck. He was ready. He proved it. And yet, even after proving it, he was pulled. The message from the staff? Readiness didn't matter. Performance didn't matter. Only the plan mattered. And that plan, by now, was visibly... The Tennessee game had become a rallying point, not just for fans, but for the media, former players, and even teammates. Because it wasn't just about touchdowns. It was about what those touchdowns represented. Potential. Potential that was unlocked by sheer force of will, not by support from the sidelines. That game was the clearest visual contradiction of Stefanski's system. Everything that had been kept in the dark during camp, every doubt cast on Sanders' readiness, was blown apart in one electric showing for touchdowns, controlled drives, poise under pressure, the kind of debut that usually cements a quarterback's role. So it was fair to ask, what had they been doing all training camp? Why were those reps wasted? Newton hammered this home. He called out the absurdity of developing a quarterback off the field, only to expect him to deliver on the field with no warning and no rhythm. And when he did deliver, they still found a way to pull him. Fans weren't blind to it. You had a rookie outperforming expectations, while the coach clung to a depth chart built in July. And suddenly, every training camp clip, every second-team rep, every press conference about progress looked less like preparation and more like misdirection. Sanders' composure through all of it became one of the few bright spots in the Browns season. He never cracked. He never played the victim. He stayed focused, stayed ready, and gave answers that made it clear he knew what was happening and he was playing the long game. But as Newton pointed out, the long game only works if the organization meets you halfway. Sanders had earned more than a pat on the back. He'd earned trust. And by not giving it to him, Stefanski sent a chilling message to the locker room. No matter what you do, the system wins. Not the player. Not the moment. The system. Stephen A. Smith backed this up in his... He called the Browns' coaching decisions insulting. Not just to Sanders, but to the idea of accountability in the NFL. He broke it down with brutal clarity. If you have a rookie who shows up under pressure and produces, you build around that. Period. You don't bench him. You don't gaslight the fan base. And you definitely don't double down on a failed process. Smith added that this wasn't about raw talent. It was about a pattern of failure, a repeated refusal to pivot, to adapt, to see what was right in front of them. Sanders had done more in one game than some Browns quarterbacks had done in 6. And yet, he was still treated like an afterthought. Stefanski's post-game comments after that Tennessee collapse were especially painful to watch. He stood there, tight-lipped, and explained the benching in vague terms, rotation, packages, team needs. But everyone watching knew this wasn't strategic. It was stubborn. It was a coach so locked into control that he couldn't embrace the success that didn't come from his playbook. Newton called it exactly that, control. Stefanski couldn't stand that Shedeur played well outside the plan, he said. So he pulled him to reestablish the plan. And it cost him the game. Fans didn't forget that. Neither did the media. And from that moment, the coaching seat turned white hot. Dan Orlovsky made one last attempt to balance the narrative. He pointed to the pressure of managing young talent. He tried to paint Stefanski as a coach stuck between expectations and development timelines. But Newton shut it down, again. Every coach has pressure, he replied. The good ones rise. The bad ones micromanage. Orlovsky's framing, while more sympathetic, just reinforced the point. This wasn't a one-off mistake. It was years of patterns, capped by a catastrophic failure to read the moment. In a league that thrives on momentum, Stefanski had killed it with his own 2 hands. Throughout the chaos, Sanders kept showing up to practice, still locked in, still leading reps. And even then, those practices became a point of contention. Media insiders started reporting that Sanders continued to take limited first-team snaps, even after the Tennessee breakout. It became the Browns' worst-kept secret. The staff had a star in their hands and still didn't know what to do with him. Newton summed it up perfectly. You don't get many chances in this league to catch lightning in a bottle. STEFANSKI caught it and threw the bottle away. Cam Newton didn't just put the Browns on blast. He put the entire NFL on notice. His words weren't meant for just one coach or one team. They were a warning shot to every franchise that still believes quarterback development can be an afterthought, that you can treat the most critical position in the game like a revolving experiment and not expect to get exposed. He brought receipts, not just rants. 13 quarterbacks under Stefanski wasn't a stat. It was an indictment. Newton spelled it out. That's not a rebuild. That's a teardown every season. You're telling me not one of those QBs was worth investing in. And when he brought up Sanders, it wasn't just about talent. It was about trust. You don't trust a guy after he gives you 4 touchdowns in a game? Then who do you trust? Stefanski never answered that question. Through all the media pressure, fan backlash, and analyst critiques, he stuck to his rehearsed lines. He talked about quarterback rooms being fluid. He insisted that every decision was made with team success in mind. But as Newton pointed out, the team wasn't succeeding. So, who was benefiting? The disconnect between words and results became unbearable. Stefanski's voice no longer inspired patience. It provoked frustration. You can't talk about development while your best young talent is rotting on the bench, Newton said. You can't preach accountability when you've cycled through more quarterbacks than wins. And honestly, who could argue with him at that point? When Shedeur Sanders sat down again for a press interview, you could hear the shift in tone. Still respectful, still team first. But the disappointment was creeping in. He spoke more like a professional dealing with politics than a rookie grateful for the opportunity. And that wasn't on him. That was the environment he'd been forced into. He talked about studying film, staying locked in, being ready when called. But there was no mistaking the undertone. This wasn't about readiness. He had been ready. The real question was whether anyone in the building had the courage to recognize it. Newton referenced that exact quote during a podcast appearance and said, "That's a guy who knows he's being held back." Looking back, the red flags were there from day one. Sanders' lack of first-team reps during training camp didn't go unnoticed. At the time, fans thought maybe it was about easing him in. But now it looked more like active suppression. Newton didn't hold back on this either. He called it development theater, where a team pretends to groom a player but never gives him a shot to grow. Other rookies across the league were getting reps. Struggling, sure, but also improving. Sanders? He was left holding a clipboard, while the Browns kept trying the same broken formula over and over. Newton asked the obvious question. What was the point of drafting him if you weren't going to use him? And that question lingered. Even in practice, Sanders was reportedly lighting things up. Teammates whispered about his arm talent. Coaches gave vague praise. But there was no movement on the depth chart. It was like he was playing in a parallel universe where performance didn't affect position. Cam Newton's commentary turned brutally honest. There's 2 types of coaches, he said. Ones who adapt to talent, and ones who force talent to adapt to them. Stefanski was the second kind, and that's why he failed. That wasn't just analysis, it was a diagnosis. And the Browns were the patient bleeding out. The Titans' game remained a turning point, and Newton kept circling back to it. Every time someone tried to defend Stefanski, he brought up the film. "Watch the tape," he said. "That kid was ballin'. Period." And he was right. Sanders looked comfortable, confident, and in command. He played like a quarterback who'd been overlooked for far too long. But what happened next? Getting benched mid-game was the moment that confirmed the dysfunction. Newton called it the death rattle of Stefanski's tenure. Not because of the loss, but because of what it revealed. The coaching staff would rather lose with their plan than win with someone else's momentum. That mindset was toxic. Publicly, Sanders never let the bitterness show. But privately, sources started hinting at tension, confusion, frustration, and who could blame him? He'd done everything right. handled the process like a pro, stepped up when called, delivered on the field, and still got sidelined. Newton emphasized that this wasn't just a young player being impatient. This was a talented quarterback being mishandled by a coach who refused to evolve. How many chances does a coach get to be wrong before people start listening to the players? Newton asked, and honestly, it was hard to come up with a good answer. Stephen A. Smith came in again, louder than ever. He said the quiet part out loud. If Stefanski isn't fired after the season, the Browns are telling us they're okay with mediocrity. That line lit up social media because it was no longer just a question of performance. It was a question of philosophy. Smith and Newton found rare agreement on this point. Quarterback development is the most important job an NFL coach has, and Stefanski had failed. Not once, not twice, 13 times. That's not just a red flag, Smith said. That's a full-blown alarm. Stefanski's final interviews of the season were almost surreal, still trying to defend decisions, still talking about evaluation windows and rotational strategies. The press wasn't buying it. The fans weren't buying it. And by now, not even ownership was buying it. The writing was on the wall, and Newton read it out loud. He's done, not out of spite, but because in today's NFL, you don't survive this kind of mismanagement. You don't bury a quarterback who saved your game and expect to keep your job. The league had moved on. Stefanski hadn't, and that was the end of the story. Dan Orlovsky eventually conceded, not with a full mea culpa, but with a subtle shift. He started acknowledging that maybe the Browns had mishandled Sanders, that maybe Stefanski's system wasn't as QB-friendly as once thought. It was the kind of soft reversal analysts make when they know the tide has turned. Cam Newton didn't gloat. He didn't have to. The scoreboard told the story. Sanders had played one half and made it unforgettable. Stefanski coached 4 seasons and left behind 13 forgotten quarterbacks. The contrast was too sharp to ignore. This wasn't just about Cam Newton throwing shade. It was about accountability, about a league that finally values development over lip service. If you believe young quarterbacks deserve real support, not empty words, drop your thoughts below. Let us know if the Browns got it wrong and what you think is next for Shadur. Hit that like, hit that subscribe, and keep watching. We're just getting started.